Thanks for joining us for this conversation on the environmental impacts of wind and solar. I'm Paige Lambermont, a research fellow in CEI Center for Energy and Environment, and this is part of a new video series we'll be releasing periodically. Joining me today is Sarah Montalbano, who is an energy policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. We'll be discussing her recent paper, Shattered Green Dreams: The Environmental Costs of Wind and Solar. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paige. This is a great paper, and I'm excited to talk about it with you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. One thing I really liked that you talked about in the paper is trade-offs. I think that when it comes to energy, people fail to acknowledge trade-offs a lot of the time. All energy sources, of course, come with trade-offs. And I think that in particular, the trade-offs associated with wind and solar are really under-discussed. So really happy that you got to discuss that here. Do you want to run us through a little bit of a intro of the paper, what's about, what your arguments are?
Yeah, thank you. So Shattered Green Dreams, the environmental costs of wind and solar is, I think, trying very hard and I think does a good job of talking about the under-discussed challenges of wind and solar because that is not something you're hearing a lot in the general news cycle. And a lot of those are about material requirements and the fact that their lifespans are only 20 to 25 years. So you have compounding disposal and recycling challenges as well. And then you need to replace those, which just compounds the material effects. There's also, I think, a lot of problems with the intermittent weather dependent sources, like wind and solar, those they're not consistently generating electricity. And what that means is that they have large land use requirements because they are not dense. And that's, I think, a big one. And there's also ecological impacts too that I think are under discussed and under researched. So this paper really tries to summarize the current state of the research on it, and it's been a good project to work on.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit more about those material inputs. I know that there's a lot of mining concerns and a lot of the resources that go into both the wind turbines and the solar panels are pretty intense. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I apologize. I'm recovering from an illness here, so take the coughing and
No
try to
worries.
ignore it. But existing estimates of what we have is that, reaching net zero carbon emissions is going to take more materials than we really have available. And the International Energy Agency expects the total mineral demand from clean energy will at least quadruple from 2020 levels to reach net zero. And what that means is 50 new lithium mines, 60 new nickel mines, and 17 more cobalt mines constructed around the world by 2030. That's 5 short years, and I really don't think that's going to happen. And when we talk about these things, you know, copper is a huge one for these kind of net zero demands. This is the electricity metal. We need this for a bunch of electronics, for building the transmission lines, the EVs, the batteries, all of this stuff. And even under a baseline scenario where we are not pursuing net zero, we're going to need 115% more copper over the next 30 years than has ever been mined in human history up till 2018. So this is a huge
Wow.
endeavor. It's an enormous project, and frankly, these wind and solar requirements, all of this needs to be mined, right? And it comes back down also to the replacement factor. If they're only lasting 20 or 25 years, then you're going to need to do this 4 times over in the same lifespan that you would have for a natural gas turbine or a nuclear plant. So all of that is compounded. And what makes it worse is that we are getting these minerals and materials domestically. We are actually getting them from overseas where they have more lax environmental and human rights and labor standards.
Right. A lot of these minerals come from China and from
Mhm.
other countries with really poor records on, especially on human rights, but
Mhm.
on how they mine these materials, what goes into them, how
Mhm.
pure they actually are when you get them, all of those things.
Yes. Yeah, it's really scary because the U.S. has abdicated its mining role to foreign countries that are not necessarily going to be friendly to us in the future. And even those friendly countries that we do procure a lot of minerals and materials from, think Canada, Australia, places like this will also have their own ambitious net zero goals and will need their own minerals for a lot of that stuff. And that's a national security issue, but in this paper, we really try to focus in on the fact that this isn't environmentally friendly. either. If we're fueling our, wind turbines and solar panels with minerals across the world, these are destroying their own environments. And that's not something that is fixed by simply being out of sight and out of mind for the American consumer. Emissions know no borders. This is a pretty, I think, cut and dry issue for the environment people to be concerned about. And I'm certainly concerned about it. And I think it's important that we have child labor in a lot of these countries that are actually mining these materials for us. So that's something we cover in the paper as well.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's good to use resources to do useful things, but we should be
Hmm.
using them efficiently and well, and allowing them to go to their best use, and not sort of foisting requirements that end up sort of subverting efficiency. I mean, there's also the problem, like the United States is one of the most mineral rich countries in the world by far, and we
Yes.
simply refuse to allow companies that otherwise could to build mines successfully, operate them successfully, receive the permits they need to receive. I mean, when
Yeah.
we're talking about copper mines, there are so many stalled out copper mines in the United States right now that I can't even like run out. Like, there's Pebble Mine, and there's all
Yep.
kinds of mining
Sure.
projects
I
that
will
have
talk
just
about
not
that
gotten off the
for
ground yet. Do you want to talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit?
Yeah, I love it. So I grew up in Alaska, and the Pebble Mine is something I remember from my childhood. I remember these No on Pebble bumper stickers that were everywhere. And it's been, 2 decades and Pebble isn't any closer to completion. And Center of the American Experiment is obviously very concerned with mining as well because Minnesota has a world-class copper, nickel, cobalt deposit in the Duluth complex up in the north of the state. So we have world-class deposits. We have the Twin Metals project that was proposed in 2016 that hasn't gone anywhere, thanks largely, I think, to permitting delays and concerns about water and a bunch of stuff that has been flip-flopped between administrations. And also the New Range copper nickel project, which has also been, proposed 2 decades ago and still isn't closer to being actually permitted and complete. So I'm heartened by the fact that this administration is taking a lot of steps to give more certainty for these developers. But that's that's the reason that the IEA's estimates here are kind of crazy for the U.S. to meet is we have such a slow permitting process compared to a lot of countries around the world, and we could speed this up without sacrificing any environmental protections. This is a lot of paperwork, and it could be done a lot better, a lot faster, and we'd still maintain a pristine environment, and we wouldn't be offshoring environmental impacts to, children in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that are mining our cobalt. It's really, I think, a win-win solution to try to do more domestic mining where we can, allow more exploration and development, and talk about how we can procure minerals from allies instead of enemies.
Yeah, when we talk about these permits, it's not just, one permitting process that you go through that's orderly and predictable and reasonable. And, you fill out the requisite forms and then you tell them what you're doing and it's assessed and then it happens. It's you have to apply for your Clean Water Act permit, which triggers a review. And then you're applying for a permit under the Air Act that triggers a review. And then there's an Endangered Species Act review and the NEPA reviews tied into
Mhm.
all of it. And each of these reviews triggers a lot of the time the same or similar paperwork to be started and finished over a period of time redundantly. And then as
Mhm.
soon as the next thing happens, you're beginning the same process again instead of doing them in parallel or doing them in some sort of useful and straightforward way. And we're to a point now where our permitting situation is so dramatic and so difficult to navigate that rather than do something in the United States that could be done through a simple permitting process and be done well and safely and with thoughts to environmental impact, thoughts to whatever the runoff from the mine is, all of those things, instead of doing that, because it's impossible to mill the mine here, you're going to buy your cobalt from China or your copper from China, and the ultimate environmental impact is so much more intense. And so
It is.
it's really baffling that the idea to protect the environment by doing this permitting process is what's ultimately resulting in a far more deleterious effect on the environment later on down the line. It's just really kind of boggles the mind.
It is.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
And
when we're
I
go ahead.
I would note just on that last point that this has become an extremely litigious process, and
Yes.
that adds tons of unpredictability to the timelines here. With all of these separate moving parts, sometimes you're getting local, state, and federal permitting approvals, and then you are sued immediately, almost regardless of the facts of the case and of the permits you've actually submitted. And that can take years. And in the current system, that has just recently, I think, been made a little more reasonable. Federal judges can just remand this back to the agency, and then you're back to square one. They have to do their permitting all over again, and that takes more time. So I'll get off the point for now, since this isn't truly discussed in Shattered Green Dreams, but this was the subject of an earlier paper that I wrote in October 2024 with a mining consultant and expert of 30 something years. You know, she's brilliant and she's seen this firsthand. And she said, yeah, the permitting process is number one challenge here for new mines in the
Yeah.
US.
And I mean, really, it's for any energy project. As we're talking about
Yes.
meeting data center demand in the coming years, we're going to need
Hmm.
new nuclear and new gas, and to be able to build new pipeline capacity, and to be able to do new transmission capacity in some cases, from data centers to power
Hmm.
plants and vice versa. And all of these things require permits, and they require a permitting process that's orderly and fast. And there's only so many categorical exclusions under NEPA that are going to be helpful. At a certain point, we just need to reform the law so that it treats all sources of power equally, all sorts of projects equally, and just reasonably assesses their actual environmental impacts and prevents actual harms while allowing reasonable business to take place.
Absolutely. I could not agree
Um,
more with that.
and yeah, that's just one of those things that we get on our high horse about, but
Hmm.
it's just so important. I think when
Hmm.
we're talking about all this, the material impacts, the material uses, can you talk a little bit about both capacity factor and like the nameplate capacity of some of these facilities, like how long they're supposed to last for, how long they actually last for, and sort of how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like this point because, when we build a natural gas turbine or a coal plant, those can last 40 to 60 years easily. A nuclear plant, there are many that are getting their permits for 60 years, 80 years. There's even speculation that these things could run for 100 years. But when we talk about wind and solar, what they really a key disadvantage here is that they're only lasting 20 or 25 years, and that's how long they're warranted, right? So they drop off in their electric generating capacity over time. Wind turbines, I think, have some wear and tear that they need to perform, serious maintenance on. And part of why these technologies are not quite such a good deal is really that they are generating electricity intermittently, right? So let's start with wind turbines. Wind turbines in 2024 generated electricity about 34% of the time. That's the capacity factor for the electric utility people that know that term. But it 34% of the time, if I showed up a third of the time to work, I would be fired,
Yeah,
right? Uh,
very quickly.
yeah,
You're
very
not
quickly.
lasting anywhere for very long, working 34% of the time.
No, no, exactly. And solar is even worse. Solar photovoltaic is getting 23%. Okay, I'll tell my boss I'm showing up a quarter of the time. And so that's part of it, and it's coming on a intermittent, unpredictable cycle. That adds a lot of wear and tear to the grid too, because they need to anticipate, okay, when is this electricity coming on to the grid? We need to make plans around this. And contrast that with natural gas. Natural gas is running about 60% of the time in 2024. And nuclear is kind of the crown jewel of this portfolio because it can run basically 24/7, except for scheduled maintenance and occasional shutdowns. And that means their capacity factor was 92% of the time in 2024. So they're generating more electricity with fewer material inputs and doing it over a longer span of time. So that's part of the trade-off here as well. How much electricity do you actually get?
Yeah, and also noting here that the poor gas plants are really getting a raw deal in all of this because they could operate at similar capacity factors to
Yes.
nuclear. They're simply not allowed to do so because when you
Hmm.
see that 68% that wind needs left, and that almost 80% that the solar needs to make it up, that's being made up largely by gas and some by coal. Like those things
Hmm.
are being ramped up to meet the gap. And
Yes.
so the gas plants get kind of a raw deal because they're forced to ramp up and down to meet the demand from the wind and solar. And in a lot of the grid systems, they're not super well compensated for that idle time that they, otherwise wouldn't need to take because they're capable of operating through that time.
Mhm.
So
You
that's sort of
understand
another element to
utilities
this.
better than I do. But yeah, well, part of it too is the federal regulations, right?
Yeah.
Coal plants are only operating 42% of the time, and that's because they have to meet a bunch of EPA standards for, particulates and, all this stuff. So coal and natural gas aren't running as much as they could, which means they're more expensive to do. So that's astute. That's a good point.
Yeah, which contributed to a lot of the closures over the last decade we've seen. And
Hmm.
now, as demand is ramping up, a lot of plants that would otherwise have still existed are closed. And that's not even reflected as one of the, when we're talking about the downside effects of wind and solar, that's one that doesn't even get talked about a lot. It's the fact that they inadvertently or advertently forced the closure of a lot of gas and coal plants that would otherwise still be available to meet coming demand right now,
Exactly. Exactly.
which is,
Yeah.
really worth noting.
Mhm.
Now, I know that a lot of these things, they don't last as long as they're supposed to, all of that. What happens next? What is the sort of recycling or throwing away? How are those disposed of? Where are they disposed of? Is it possible?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it varies a lot by region and what the project is. But, a lot of these components aren't traditionally recyclable. So think about the fiberglass and carbon fiber in wind turbine, blade pieces. Like that's a huge blade. You don't really want to break it up. A lot of these end up just sitting in landfills. And the batteries in electric vehicles and backup battery storage, those have a lot of hazardous toxic chemicals you don't want to be necessarily recycling. The other part of it is economic though. And what we see is that, maybe 10-15% of solar panels are being recycled, despite the fact that they are mostly glass. Actually, just because of the economics of it, it'll cost, $15 to do this instead of $5 to dispose of it in a, hazardous landfill. So that's a really concerning part of this is, well, where does all of this disposable power plant waste actually go? And what do we do about it? And again, you're doing this, 3-4 times as often as you would be when you're decommissioning a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant. All of this is happening more often because they're more disposable and they wear down. Also, an interesting point on this is that 20 to 25 years is really kind of the maximum. They
Yeah.
can last longer, but what happens is our federal tax system has incentivized, up until very recently, repowering. So you go in and you replace a bunch of components or you tear down the whole thing and repower again. And so that means that in, I think, 2023 or so, the median age of repowering wind turbines was actually only about 11 years. And that's to
Wow.
requalify for the production tax credit. So compound it again. We're throwing away a bunch of waste and we're doing it even more often.
Another problem with the production tax credit from the
Another one,
Inflation
just so you
Reduction Act.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yet
exactly.
another. But yeah, so what we're seeing from this is that it has a lower capacity factor than other sources. It's
Hmm.
already rated to produce less power in the first place. Nameplate plate capacity is lower with a lower capacity factor. It lasts less long.
Hmm.
All three of those things together result in a far lower life cycle output than for
Yes.
say like a nuclear plant, which there's a lot of concrete and steel on the front end of building a nuclear plant, but then you've
Mhm.
pretty much got infinite power if you replace the valves in uranium over time. That thing will
Precisely.
last forever. So it's just
Yes.
a really different situation. That's very interesting. We should pivot into the land use requirements a bit
Oh.
because that's another big part of this, right? The
Mhm.
actual physical footprint that these take up. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, land use is a really important question that is coming up a lot because now it's starting to actually impact agricultural uses. So, the lower electricity density, all of this capacity factor issue, they're generating less. That means that they need at least 10 times as much land per unit of power produced as coal or natural gas. And before you say, wow, that sounds like a lot, that's a Brookings Institution estimate. This is not a particularly biased source. And utility scale photovoltaic to generate 1 megawatt needs between 3.5 and 10 acres.
Wow.
That's a lot of land. And when you compare it against one of your alternatives, which is nuclear, it becomes an even clearer comparison. So a 1 gigawatt nameplate capacity nuclear plant only needs about 1.3 square miles for the actual footprint of this reactor. And to have the same capacity to generate the same amount of electricity, a comparable solar installation would need 45 to 75 square miles. And
Wow.
before you go, whoa, wind is even worse. Wind is worse because they're taking 260 to 3,360 square miles because you need a lot of spacing between these
Say
turbines.
that number again. That's huge.
3,360 square miles at the upper bound estimate, and 260 at the lower bound is quite a lot when you think about this.
That's a state, two
Y-
states, maybe, depending on, I mean, you're from
It's
Alaska,
one
so
of the
your idea of
smaller
how big a
states.
state is a bit different, but that's huge.
Yes, yeah. So I was going through this, and this isn't in the paper because I realized it afterward, but I was going through crunching the numbers. That upper bound estimate, that 3,360 square miles, that's, I think, Rhode Island and Delaware put together, right? Like this is to match a 1 gigawatt nuclear reactor in actual generation. You need that much wind turbine.
And you can put four nuclear reactors on the same site.
Oh
Like
yeah.
there's a lot of nuclear plants that are 4 gigawatt. Like Vogel in Georgia is a 4 gigawatt power plant.
I
There's
knew you
four
would know
gigawatt
that.
gas plants all over the place.
Yes.
So 1 gigawatt is really it's a lot of power, but it's not you fill two states worth of land power.
No, no, it would not otherwise need that. And I when we talk about these things, a 2010 estimate was actually done to say, look, if the US tries to power itself entirely on wind turbines, and that's back at, 2010 levels of electricity demand, right? That land necessary would be greater than two Californias. So California is not a tiny state here.
No, it's one of the bigger ones.
It's one of the bigger ones,
Is it the
yes.
third
So,
biggest?
I think so. Something
Yeah,
to that
Alaska,
effect.
Texas, California.
Alaska wins. Yeah, we always do. Um, but yeah, I mean, this kind of land use is crazy, and it has a lot of impacts on agriculture. And what you'll hear is, oh, wind turbines, you can cite a lot of things, a lot of agriculture in the spacing between the turbines. And I think the important question there is, well, how much of that is actually happening? And are these the same kind of crops and, animal grazing? Are these the same kind of things you would be doing if the wind turbines weren't there? So it's not just that you're pushing agriculture aside, it's also that you're changing the type of agriculture that's occurring. So there's a lot of concerns about land use, and I think they're all very warranted, especially when it's, these massive projects are abutting communities like the Lava Ridge Wind Project in Idaho that met tons of opposition that wasn't really listened to because, well, it's on federal lands, and the federal government makes that decision.
Yeah. And there seems to be a huge disparity here
Mhm.
because if you're talking about, launching a rocket like the SpaceX has been doing, or you're
Yes.
talking about building a mine, if there's an impact on like a single animal, then we're
Hmm.
not allowed to do that thing. But when it comes to something like wind and solar, there are insane impacts on wildlife that go ignored because that permitting process doesn't seem to be anywhere near as stringent as for other things. And it seems to be just kind of an unequal handling of the permitting for things. Do you want to talk about some of the wildlife impacts of both wind and solar?
I would love to because this is under talked about, and of course, all human activities have impacts on wildlife. Like I'm not here to say that we shouldn't do any projects if they have any impacts on wildlife, but the point here is that a lot of environmentalists take that tack when it's oil, gas, mining, timber, things like that. And wind and solar have their own impacts here. There's serious concerns about whale habitats and offshore wind. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA actually says, offshore wind's not causing any lethal effects in whales, but there's evidence that there's risk of direct collisions with infrastructure, there's changes to their habitat, their feeding and migration patterns, and there were a couple of pretty high-profile incidents with whales coming onto shore deceased after some of these big offshore wind projects started. And I think that warrants more investigation. Birds and bats also, I think, are really impacted by the onshore wind turbines. There's quite a bit of evidence that there's direct collision risks, habitat fragmentation, and in the grand scheme of things, it's likely to be more than 1 million birds per year for U.S. birds. And obviously there's a lot of impacts with buildings and domestic cats. Like all of these things are impacting birds as well and on a greater order of magnitude. But what matters a lot, I think, here is the quantity of birds isn't maybe necessarily the problem, but that there are actual qualitative differences in the kinds of birds that are affected and struck by turbines. There's things like birds of prey, shorebirds, seabirds, and other slower reproducing species. Um, and before you say, well, it sounds like solar panels are doing fine here, there's some concern too that the reflectiveness of solar panels, a big utility scale field, those actually look like lakes from above to birds that are coming down. So there's been hypothesized, and there's some evidence mounting that there's a lake effect due to the reflectiveness. So you get a lot of seabirds and shorebirds that descend towards these things, and there's actually collision impacts here too. So there's a lot of ecological effects. Nothing is truly damning, I think, but there's a lot that should be investigated and simply hasn't.
Well, it's really more the problem with that is just the contrast, right?
Yes.
Is that for some things that we're trying to accomplish, some activities, there's a
Mhm.
really, really high bar. And for
Yes.
others, there's a very low bar. And I think that it's just the difference there is pretty stark and worth talking about, worth noting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else from the paper that we didn't touch on that like a point you really want to make?
I think we've done a pretty good job on it. I would bring it back though to the trade-offs and that we have a serious concern with the environmental trade-offs required here, and that the trade-off for the electricity generation simply may not be worth it. And that's also not to say that they're not appropriate in some cases and some uses, but the approach that the U.S. government has taken has been a all solar panels, all wind turbines, all battery storage, everywhere for all purposes. This is appropriate everywhere. And that's simply not true. And I think a lot of local communities need to be educated on these points, these concerns with environmental consequences like land use, ecology, material demand, and disposal. Or you will end up with a lot of people that are unhappy with the decisions being made about their electricity grid and where their electricity grid is coming from. So I think this is a really important resource for a lot of people to come find the facts, see exactly the research I've done because
Yeah.
it's meant for people who are trying to engage in local decisions who don't know how or where to get all of this information in one place.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the point of this isn't to say you can't build wind, you can't build
No,
solar.
of
The
course
point of
not.
this is to say that the government has engaged in a years-long campaign to
Mhm.
make these things the only option, and so we should question that. I know a lot of the
Yes.
time people will ask me, how much wind and solar do you think the right amount for the grid is? And I say, as much as the market will bear in the absence of subsidies, because it's
Yes.
not about how much of something I think there should be. It's
Mhm.
about whether or not the government should be engaging on a campaign to force Americans to use one thing rather than another. And I think that in this case, it's been pretty disastrous, and that some of the impacts are still coming forward. So, thank you so much for talking about this with me today, Sarah. This has been great. Where can people find more of your work, and what are you working on right now?
Oh, that's a great question. You can find me on americanexperiment.org. I'm in the energy and environment tab almost all of the time. I've got a major report coming up, I think, actually about healthcare, which is kind of crazy. I've been tapped in to do some data stuff, so that report is nearing completion. But we are continuing our emphasis on mining and material use and the entire concept of shattered green dreams, the environmental costs of wind and solar. That these are costs you haven't heard about. So I will keep you apprised, and we can talk again soon on some of these things.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for
Yeah,
joining me, Sarah. This has been great.
this has been great. Thank you.